Hello everybody, in this video I'm gonna introduce you to my series, The Gospel of Matthew. I'm going to start here with a little question. What does gospel actually mean? The word gospel has its origin in the Old English word Godspell. But Godspell is not a combination of God and spell, it is combined out of good and spell. Spell is an Old English word for story or telling. So the word Godspell actually means good story or good telling. Godspell was used to gloss or shorten the Latin word bona annunciatio, which is related to the Greek evangelion, which means good news. There are two definitions of gospel that are actually pretty close to each other. The teaching or revelation of Christ. This definition relates more to Jesus' message in general, the actual good news. The second one belongs to the Gospels of the New Testament by Mark, Luke, John and Matthew, the record of Christ's life and teaching on the first 4 books of the New Testament. Let's go ahead and talk about Matthew a little bit more. This is Matthew. Matthew was born in 1st century Galilean, which was neither part of Judea nor the Roman province of Judea at the time. Herod Antipas, son of Herod the Great, which later became famous for a role in events that led to the execution of John the Baptist and Jesus, was reigning the country at the moment. There are no accounts of Matthew's childhood, but that's not a very important part of his story. He later became a well-educated tax collector who collected money from mostly Hebrew people for the king Antipas. At the time, tax collectors were considered outcasts for the Jewish people. And that's when Jesus comes into Matthew's story. Jesus walks up to Matthew and chooses him, the tax collector, as one of his disciples. The crowd got very angry and criticized Jesus for spending time with waste like Matthew. After these things happening, he walked around on Jesus' side as one of his closest disciples, a big part of his lifetime, ministering all the miracles and teaching Jesus performed. After Christ's crucifixion, Matthew was one of few who saw him after. He then became co-author of the New Testament Apocrypha, a document which contained the 4 Gospels of Jesus. Matthew wrote the Gospel of Matthew, the first book of the New Testament. He also walked around Turkey and other places and preached the Gospel, as Jesus commanded. There are no accounts of Matthew's death, but many people consider that he lived to an age up to 60 or 70. Last, I'm gonna tell you something about the actual Gospel he wrote, the Gospel of Matthew. The Gospel of Matthew was probably the first book of the New Testament written, but today it definitely is the first one printed down in the New Testament. To say it from a very objective view, it basically is the story of Jesus being rejected by Israel, teaching his 12 disciples, dying, and sending his apostles in all the world to spread out the evangelium. The thing about his gospel is that no one actually knows when or by who it was written. Experts trace it back to about 80 to 90 AD and say it was rather written by a well-educated Jew than Matthew himself, and it was only orally passed. I don't believe so, and I really don't want to go into this topic too much, because I think we should focus on the message and the writing, and we should honor Matthew for what he did, because God does so too. The Gospel itself contains 28 chapters, 1071 verses and 22,642 words. Let's do the math real quick. That's about 38 verses per chapter and approximately 21 words per verse. Theologists split up the Gospel of Matthew in 5 main blocks. It starts with a prologue that goes from chapter 1 to about the end of chapter 2, in which the author mainly talks about Jesus' descendants and his birth. The first block begins with Jesus being baptized by John in chapter 3 and ends right before chapter 8. In 3 of the 4 chapters, Jesus talks to a huge crowd and teaches them about the laws his ancestors made. The second block is a lot shorter than the first one. It only goes from about chapter 8 till chapter 12. Jesus performs miracles, provides his disciples with the theology behind what he did, and sends them out to preach to the people of Israel. Block number 3 contains more of Christ's teaching in form of parables. For example, the parable of the wheat and weeds, or the parable of the mustard seed, or the parable of the yeast. This block goes from about chapter 13 to chapter 16. Still in chapter 16, Jesus first predicts his death. That's where block number 4 starts. Block number 4 contains some parables, some teachings, and Jesus healing people. The last block, number 5, begins in chapter 21 with Jesus entering Jerusalem and him talking about the end times in chapter 24. After all the main blocks, the last 3 chapters contain some more parts of the end time and the plot against Jesus, his death, and resurrection. Now that you know who Matthew was and what he wrote, I hope you're curious enough to check out my upcoming series, The Gospel of Matthew, in which I read each chapter and talk about the theology behind it. Subscribe for your daily Bible reading, and thanks for watching.